Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today, we're going to be talking about the Age of Exploration. Because, although American history has obviously taken place in America, it did not entirely begin in America. The Europeans who settled the Americas did so for reasons that stretch all the way back to the Middle Ages. In fact, the first known exploration of the New World was undertaken in the Middle Ages by the Vikings, who briefly settled what they called Vinland, in what is now Newfoundland, around 1000 AD, but did not, as far as we can tell, stay very long, perhaps driven away by conflict with the American Indians, or just by a changing environment. But for most of the early medieval period, Western Europe was focused primarily on its own survival after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, did survive for 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, and for a long time was widely respected in Western Europe for its wealth, for its heritage as the remnant of the Roman Empire. And so when the Byzantine Empire, under threat of invasion by the forces of Islam, called on the Pope for help, the Crusades began. As Christians from Western Europe went to the Middle East, in theory, to reclaim the land from Muslim invaders, land that had once been Christian, and to defend the Orthodox Christians in the Eastern Roman Empire, in what is now Turkey. Crusades took place off and on between 1095 and 1271. But when the last European crusaders were driven back out of the Middle East. But during that time, through their own travel or more often trade, Europeans in the Middle East were introduced to the luxuries of the Far East: China, India, the Spice Islands of Indonesia, silk, spices, fine porcelain, other luxuries made their way back to Europe. And eventually, the trade with the Far East came to be dominated by the merchants of northern Italy. Most of Italy in those days being a set of city-states, small independent countries based around a large city, many of which were in turn based on the wealth that came from trade, which again they undertook through to the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire at Constantinople. And as these city-states got richer, their leading merchants had not just money, but even better, free time. Time for hobbies, collecting curiosities, fossils, volcanic rocks, antiquities from the Roman Empire that lay in ruins about them, learning more about the wider world, not just what was needed for survival, as most people had to focus on the bare minimum, the bare necessities during the Middle Ages. As they started to collect antiquities and oddities, they began to develop an interest in their own history of the ancient Roman Empire and the Greek culture that had so heavily influenced ancient Rome. Indeed, through trade with the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East, Italians became familiar with ancient and even modern Greek scholarship and the science of the Muslim world, which in those days was the most advanced on earth. And as Turkish forces advanced into the Byzantine Empire and eventually conquered it, many of the greatest scholars of the Roman Empire fled to Italy, expanding the scientific community there and artistic community, leading to a rebirth or a renaissance of interest in science and art, which would in turn inspire and through better technology permit more and more exploration of the world. And while the Renaissance began in Italy, it eventually spread elsewhere in Europe. Although for most of Europe in the 1400s, warfare was much more common than scholarship. Indeed, in the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain and Portugal, in the 1400s, the Reconquista was being completed. This was itself a crusade, which had been underway from 732, when the Moors, Muslims from North Africa, had conquered all of Iberia. And Iberians had fought back for 660 years. Pardon me, 760 years. So whatever you can say about the Reconquista, those who undertook it were certainly not quitters. Indeed, by the 1400s, it was nearly complete. Most of the Iberian Peninsula was divided into the Kingdom of Portugal, or Castile, or Granada, a small Moorish kingdom in the southeast. Now, by the mid-1400s, Portugal no longer had a direct border with a Moorish kingdom, and so they spent most of the 1400s exploring by sea. Prince Henry the Navigator, the third son of King John I of Portugal, was not himself a navigator. He got seasick, in fact, but he founded a school, eventually a university, to train others in navigation, and he funded voyages of exploration of course, to expand Portugal's knowledge, and of course, with the goal of permitting conquest and trade. Under his leadership, Portugal developed some of the most advanced sailing ships, most advanced navigational methods of the early 1400s, and began to explore the west coast of Africa, seeking to expand their empire, to fight the forces of Islam, to spread Christianity, and find new sources of wealth. Indeed, many historians have described the motives of early European explorers as being God, gold, and glory. And some people today tend to discount the importance of God to our earlier explorers, saying that it was just something people said to justify what they were doing. And I'm sure for some people it was. But I believe many of these explorers and the people who supported them were entirely sincere in their belief that they were doing what God wanted them to do, that they were inspired and guided to do His will, to do some of the things that, good or bad, took the bravery and daring that these explorers undertook. I think required a faith in something larger than themselves, or even larger than a desire for wealth, as big a motivation as that is for some people. The one thing that might indicate that is that one of Prince Henry's inspirations for exploring Africa, and hopefully perhaps one day Asia, was the medieval legend of Prester John, a supposed Christian king located somewhere in Africa or Asia, who, if European Christians could find him, would be a powerful ally against the forces of Islam. In fact, he was fictional, but there were those who truly hoped to find this legendary great king. And while Prince Henry's men never found Prester John, they did discover the Azores, a set of islands in the Atlantic which Portugal still owns. Likewise, the Madeira Islands, which Portugal still owns, and claimed ports down the coast of West Africa, where they became involved in the slave trade. Eventually, the Portuguese would become the first Europeans to sail south of the Sahara Desert and discover the valuable gold reserves of West Africa, and indeed become involved in the slave trade, bringing great wealth to Portugal, but also opening a very tragic chapter in the history of the world. Slavery not being new, but becoming a much bigger trade involving far more people under harsher conditions than had often, although not always, been the case in the past. As Portugal was rising in the 1400s, the Italians suffered a major blow to their economy in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople, which they came to call and eventually officially renamed Istanbul, bringing an end to the Byzantine Empire and cutting off the Italians' ability to trade with East Asia. For Portugal, of course, whose sailors were moving further and further down the west coast of Africa, this was a tremendous opportunity if they could just find a way to sail all the way around Africa to Asia, which was reasonable to assume. After all, the three continents of the world, Europe, Africa, and Asia, were surrounded by one vast ocean. You just had to find the right route, which Prince Henry the Navigator never got to see. He died in 1460, too soon to see the greatest triumph of his navigational efforts. 1497 to 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed all the way around the southern tip of Africa to India and back, in charting a course by sea from Europe to India for the first time. In 1510, Portugal claimed the Indian territory of Goa and would control that and other ports till 1961. They would establish colonies in East Timor, which they would hold till 1975, Macau and China, which they held till 1999. A number of colonies along the coast of Africa, most of which they held till 1974 or 75, and a large colony in Brazil. The Portuguese had the world's first global empire, and, if you count some of their smaller colonies, the longest lasting. And their success inspired other countries. In 1492, the rulers who would eventually unite Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, Ferdinand being king of Aragon, Isabella being queen of Castile, still two separate kingdoms, but soon to be united through their marriage. In 1492, they completed the Reconquista, driving the last Moors from the kingdom of Granada, in a small but wealthy Muslim kingdom in what's now southern Spain. Not only completing the 760 years of the Reconquista, but also looting the fabulous wealth of the kingdom. And of course, they weren't going to stop there. Spanish forces moved into northern Africa. Indeed, Spain still controls two cities on the north coast of Africa, much to the irritation of Morocco. And they also had time for other things. It's true they're going to invade Africa, but having retaken the entire Iberian Peninsula, there is a bit of breathing room, perhaps. And again, a great deal of wealth. And along the way, Ferdinand and Isabella, in uniting their kingdoms, helped build Spain into a fairly centralized nation-state. And not nearly as centralized or as powerful a government as we expect of countries today, but by medieval standards, a very strong centralized government, and a government backed up by the force of the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition in Spain being controlled by the government above and beyond the Catholic Church, which is why the Inquisition was often so much more intrusive and bloody in Spain than it was in other parts of Europe. Wanting to continue their expansion, and with wealth to spare, the Spanish decided to gamble not just on military expeditions into Africa, but on the plans of Christopher Columbus. Now, most educated Europeans, despite what you'll sometimes hear, knew or at least assumed the world was round. After all, the ancient Greeks said a sphere was the perfect shape, and therefore the earth had to be a sphere, and the ancient Greeks were pretty much always right. After all, it is the Renaissance. But they weren't sure how far around this spherical earth might be. There were two widespread conjectures, both of which came from the ancient Greeks. Some had calculated the earth must be about 25,000 miles around. Others believed it was a little over 15,000 miles around. Most Europeans believed that the larger figure. Indeed, that turns out to be pretty close to the truth. Columbus, however, had convinced himself the smaller figure was true. The earth was about 15,000 miles around, and most of that was land. And therefore, it should be pretty easy to reach Asia by sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, and indeed, that could be done with the kind of ships that existed at the time. And so, hoping to spread Catholicism, to find greater wealth, and to promote its national honor, Spain gave Columbus 3 ships and permission to gather a crew and sail into the unknown. And today, Columbus comes in for a lot of criticism, and quite a bit of that is fair. He had opened up a period in which Europeans often mistreated American Indians. He himself treated them very badly on several occasions, sometimes horrifying even other Europeans. But on On the other hand, what he undertook was an act of great navigational skill and personal daring. Although he thought he knew it was out there, he didn't know, and neither did his crew. I believe that in some ways, Columbus's expedition to the New World was a braver, bolder undertaking than man's mission to the moon in the 1960s. After all, at least we knew where the moon was. We could see it. Columbus was just trusting in God and his navigational aids. And he was successful, sighting land October 12, 1492, having exhausted nearly all his provisions and preparing to turn back for Spain if he didn't find something soon. He probably landed in the Bahamas, explored some of the islands of the Caribbean, and convinced himself he had found the East Indies. He believed Cuba to be Japan. Believing that he had found the Indies, he called the local people Indians, resupplied, and headed back home in 1493. He was named Admiral of the Ocean Sea and made 3 more voyages to the New World before dying in 1506, still convinced he had found Asia. And of course, by 1493, Portugal had explored most of Africa's west coast. Spain had just discovered a new continent. And so between them, they have the whole world at their feet. And Portugal and Spain decided to do something very rare in human history. They decided to share. But, and an idea we'll come back to multiple times in this class, sharing is hard. And so they had to find someone who could help them divide the world between them and turn to the most powerful man on earth, Jesus Christ's personal representative, Pope Alexander VI. And in 1494, he devised the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the world between Spain and Portugal. Spain got nearly all of the Americas, except for part of Brazil, which is an odd coincidence, as Brazil had not yet been discovered, as far as we know, but Portugal was really insistent on a certain line of longitude that suggests they may have known about Brazil already and just not told anybody. Portugal got all of Africa, most of Asia. What other Europeans, let alone people in the Americas, Africa, or Asia, thought about this, the Pope did not inquire. From their initial colonies in the Caribbean, the Spanish began to explore North and South America. Juan Ponce de Leon explored Florida in 1513, looking for the Fountain of Youth. Unsuccessfully, we believe, although they do claim to have it in St. Augustine. Although there are an awfully lot of old people in Florida, so I'm not sure about that one. The same year, 1513, Vasco de Balboa led an expedition across the Isthmus of Panama and became the first European to see another ocean, an ocean that looked so peaceful that Balboa named it the Pacific. America itself was named for another explorer, an Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, who explored the coast of South America. But as America was explored, it turned out to be a great disappointment. Columbus had been looking for a way to sail to Asia. Instead, he found the world's biggest speed bump. And so the next few centuries would be spent trying to find an all-water route to Asia. Around the Americas, maybe through the Americas, or around Africa, which I've already mentioned, Vasco da Gama charted just a couple years later, sailing around Africa to India. Whereas another Portuguese explorer, a few years later, would go the other way. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan led an expedition west across the Atlantic, around South America, through the Strait of Magellan, named in his honor, and then across the Pacific Oceans, eventually ending up in the Philippines, where he himself was killed. All the Spanish returned some years later, claimed the islands, and named them for King Philip of Spain. And while Magellan himself died in the Philippines, his crew continued their voyage around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and after almost exactly 3 years, returned to Spain. Magellan had been Portuguese by birth, but was working for Spain. and the 18 sailors to survive the entire expedition became the first men to circumnavigate the globe. But while the Americas were a navigational problem in some ways, the Spanish also discovered some opportunities there, new sources of wealth and new peoples. Now, I've already mentioned the American Indians who lived in Central and South America had created several large and powerful empires prior to the arrival of Columbus. Of course, the culture of the Maya, as we've already mentioned, was weak when the Spanish arrived, having largely destroyed their major political and urban centers in warfare with each other. But they were still widespread. Many people spoke and still speak Mayan-based languages. However, the Aztec were the dominant empire in what's now southern and central Mexico, with their capital of Tenochtitlan at what's now Mexico City. They had a very hierarchical society, a rigid class structure with a powerful military, and a very deep sense of religion, although religious beliefs quite different from those of the Spanish. When the Spanish arrived, the Aztecs weren't quite sure what to think. Some thought they might be gods, or at least messengers from the god Quetzalcoatl, who is sometimes pictured as being partially human and partly a tortoise, and the Spaniards' armor was interpreted by some Aztecs as being kind of like a tortoise shell. Because the Spanish did arrive in 1521 under the leadership of Hernan Cortez. He allied with some subject tribes who wanted their independence from the brutal and bloody rule of the Aztecs, took over Tenochtitlan, and made war against the Aztecs, the Spanish having guns, horses, armor. Even their horses had armor. Even their trained war dogs had armor. Whereas the Aztecs had armor made not of steel but of feathers, swords that were really clubs with obsidian chips. They had bows and arrows. But for all their technology, what the Spanish really had was disease. As American Indians had not really encountered many infectious diseases, whereas Europeans were well acquainted with many very dangerous ones, to which the American Indians had no natural immunity. And so, smallpox, but measles and mumps and many other diseases really brought down the Aztec Empire and the American Indians in general. It's believed between 30 and 90% of American Indians died of various diseases. And through a combination of their subjects rising up against them, better Spanish technology, and horrible Spanish diseases, the Aztecs were rapidly defeated. Indeed, the only major disease that we believe came from the New World to the Old was syphilis, which apparently the Spanish got from the Indians almost immediately in 1492, brought back to Europe in 1493, where it spread to France, and from France it spread to pretty much all of Europe by about 1494 or so, where many people believed it was the judgment of God condemning a wicked society. Now, South America, the major empire was that of the Inca in the Andes Mountains, in and around what's now Peru. And they were in the midst of a civil war between two brothers who both claimed the throne of their recently deceased father, the old emperor. And so they were pretty destabilized when Francisco Pizarro showed up with around 100 Spanish soldiers and rapidly conquered the whole empire. And being more focused, being much better armed, indeed, with their strong armor and their sharp steel swords, some Spanish soldiers said the hardest part about conquering the Inca was just how tired their arms got, chopping them in half over and over for hours. Hard work, folks. And so in 1532, the Spanish, under Pizarro, conquered the Inca and took the place of the Inca emperors, but as they had more or less done in the Aztec Empire too, just knocked off the top of the hierarchy and put themselves in charge. And in the Inca Empire, they retained the Mita System, whereby their subjects paid their taxes by working for the government. In particular, in the fabulous silver mines of Potosi. Although, in some ways, the Spanish would preserve and even spread some parts of Inca culture, The Catholic Church used the Inca languages, Quechua and Aymara, to spread the gospel, and preserved at least some parts of Inca culture in that way. Moving closer to home, between 1539 and 1542, Hernando de Soto explored the southeastern part of what's now the United States, even entering southeastern Tennessee. But he mistreated the Indians so badly that many of his men were attacked and killed, and also indirectly spread many diseases amongst the Indians, not just there, but further inland too. De Soto himself caught a fever and died. As his men fled across the Mississippi River, they dumped his corpse in the river out of fear that if it was buried or simply abandoned, the Indians would desecrate his corpse. They hated him so. And so there we have the first white man, as far as we know, in Tennessee. In the Southwest, between 1540 and 1542, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado explored the area around the Colorado River, looking for the 7 cities of Cibola, the cities of gold, based on a story that had been told by other early explorers, particularly the shipwrecked sailor Cabeza de Vaca. He never found the cities of gold. Some people speculated that some of the Pueblo towns looked golden in the sunset, but he did discover the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. 1565, the Spanish founded St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest surviving European settlement in what is now the United States. And so, having come to the New World for God, gold, and glory, the Spanish got it all. Of course, the Catholic Church came to the New World with Spain and converted the Indians of Central and South America to Catholicism, so often by force, sometimes by enslavement, but very effectively. Indeed, today, Latin America is, by percentage of its population, the most Catholic region in the world. The current Pope, as I record this, is from Latin America, in Argentina. The first Pope from outside Europe in centuries upon centuries. While the first generation of Indians who were baptized at Sword Point may not have been entirely sincere in their conversion, for in generations to come, the religion certainly took. Although elements of native religions and African religions often mixed in with Latin American Catholicism, some old gods were interpreted as Catholic saints, or Catholic saints often took on some of the traditions of older native beliefs. And of course, there was glory in the New World, if you could win it. Latin America was eventually divided up amongst viceroys, viceroy meaning in place of the king. There were several of these. New Spain was perhaps the most important viceroyalty. It encompassed what's now Mexico, the rest of Central America, Florida, parts of South America, and more. And that is, of all of them, probably the most important to know for us from the point of view of U.S. history. New Granada was another viceroyalty. A very important one was the viceroyalty of Peru, which also included Chile, parts of Bolivia, and some other areas too, that being the home of the fabulous silver mines in what is now Bolivia. And eventually the viceroyalty of La Plata was separated from that and included parts of Argentina and Uruguay and some other areas. I'm not sure that map on the slide is entirely correct, but close enough for government work. And of course, the Portuguese set up a viceroy over Brazil to rule in place of the king. Indeed, many years later, when Napoleon conquered Portugal, the Portuguese royal family would simply relocate to Brazil, it being richer in Portugal anyway. And of course, the men who conquered the New World were known as Conquistadors, and much of the land there was granted to them. Early on, towns and even small cities were granted encomiendas to various conquistadors, or even villages. An encomienda was a group of Indians entrusted to a particular Spaniard to work for him and be cared for and protected by him, and converted to Christianity under his protection. But in fact, these Indians were often treated little better than slaves. This system was seen as so abusive that the Catholic Church in particular protested against it almost immediately. And the Spanish crown pretty soon began to limit the encomiendas, ceased to grant them, as they were typically not hereditary. This system faded away, but left behind a legacy of very harsh treatment of American Indians. Many conquistadors and their descendants came to control haciendas, vast estates, sometimes run as farms, but often primarily as ranches, as it's pretty easy to raise cattle or other livestock on a large section of land. But while they were big, they often weren't very economically efficient. They were meant to be self-sufficient, to produce enough for the hacendado and his family to support themselves, have a little extra to trade, and buy some luxuries to show off to the hacendado next door. But as most of the people working there did work for the landowner, there wasn't a lot of incentive to work really hard. Indeed, this kept Latin America and Spain itself in nearly a medieval economy for centuries after the Middle Ages ended in the rest of Europe. Some cases, haciendas also included mines or other resources too, but really only a few people owned almost all the land in Central and South America, and they were immensely powerful and wanted someone to work the land. And early on, they often enslaved American Indians, one way or another. In many places, in the name of protecting them or saving their souls by converting them to Christianity. In the old Inca Empire, the Mita System kept people working for the government long after the Inca emperor was gone. They also imported slaves from Africa, especially to the Caribbean, where early Indians were often wiped out completely by disease or worked to death on the sugar plantations. So many African slaves came to the Spanish colonies, especially into the area around the Caribbean, Spain's islands there and the Caribbean coast of Central and South America. As I've already mentioned, the Catholic Church was shocked by the terrible treatment of the Indians in the encomienda system. In particular, a Dominican monk, Bartolomé de las Casas, convinced the Spanish crown that, at least in theory, Indians should be able to govern themselves under their own leaders, as long as they became Christian and were loyal to the Spanish monarchy. And while that didn't always happen, things did begin to improve. After a time, Indians in many places did gain some degree of self-government, but the severe mistreatment of American Indians early in the Spanish colonial period, and at some places throughout the entire period, gave rise to what's called the Black Legend of Spanish cruelty, still resented in many Latin American countries. And even in the 1600s and 1700s, even the 1500s, the English used this legend, partly true and partly not, of Spanish cruelty to justify their own fight against the Spanish, supposedly on behalf of the oppressed Indians. Now, some Latin American historians today and other historians do question this legend and suggest that Spain did have a number of positive legacies for the New World too. But there's unquestionably cruelty and exploitation. And besides God and glory, there was gold, and above all, silver, beyond their wildest dreams. I've mentioned more than once the great mine at Potosi. There pictured in the 1500s, it opened in 1545. There, seen today, as most of the silver was mined out by the early 1800s, all the area does still produce some tin there in the mountains of Bolivia. This produced more wealth than we can nearly imagine. Probably more silver came from that mine than any other mine in world history, possibly all other mines combined. In New Spain, there was also a great mine at Zacatecas in what is now Mexico. And this silver was minted in Peru and New Spain into what were all called pesos or dollars, or called pieces of 8, because the way to make change out of a dollar was to take a hammer and chisel and cut it up into pieces. A half dollar was literally a dollar cut in half. A quarter was a quarter of a dollar. A quarter dollar could be cut into 2 smaller pieces, so you could get 8 pieces out of a Spanish dollar. Each of the 8 pieces was, at least in the English-speaking world, sometimes called a bit. So a quarter dollar could be 2 bits. And the term dollar for a coin of this size became so widespread, many countries had dollars and thalers. When the United States became an independent country, our dollar coin was based on the Spanish dollar in size and weight of silver. Because the Spanish dollar was as widely circulated, or probably more widely circulated, in the English colonies in America than any official English money. And the U.S. dollar would retain that size and weight, although eventually give up most of its silver, until 1978. But this was not an unmixed blessing. All this, essentially free money, created enormous wealth for Spain, but eventually enormous inflation, eventually destroying the Spanish economy. And because there was essentially free money just flowing in, there was not a lot of incentive to produce manufacturing. They had not developed a real advanced banking system. Agriculture remained pretty primitive. Some people have argued that the modern world did not really reach Spain until around 1900. And this money from the New World was part of the reason, a big part of the reason. And besides all this, the Spanish got many other things, many new crops, corn, tomatoes, chocolate, all came from the New World, as did, as I've mentioned, probably syphilis. You can find other pictures of syphilis on the internet too, but I stuck with that one. Europeans also got other crops from the New World, potatoes, pumpkins, many types of beans, although certainly were beans in the Old World too. Indians received, of course, a new religion, and also new crops. Wheat had not been seen in the New World, nor had cattle, nor horses, nor pigs, or indeed any large livestock aside from llamas and alpacas. Indeed, it's been suggested one reason American Indians had so little natural disease amongst themselves is no diseases had spread to them from animals as they did in Europe. Other livestock too, chickens and mules, new crops like peaches. We think of those as being a defining feature of Georgia, but they didn't appear in Georgia until the Spanish arrived. The honeybee came, at least the type that we think of, that was cultivated, was brought to the New World by Europeans. The Indians hated these. They called them the white man's flies, and of course they stung. Other technologies, the wheel, for example, had not been used by Indians as a machine to help them haul things. After all, there's no oxen or horses or anything else to pull a vehicle. What do you want a wheel for? I've mentioned they brought diseases like smallpox, typhus, the measles, and others. And of course, many people came from Europe and Africa, not always by choice, to the New World. And some people from the New World went to Europe, maybe by choice and maybe not. In what is known as the Columbian Exchange, the idea of the exchange of goods and people and ideas between the Old World and the New World. We mostly think of it in terms of food, because we like food. As Americans, eating is one of our favorite things. But people and ideas were very important too. I've mentioned Spain's wealth was both a blessing and a curse, making Spain wealthy and powerful in the short run, but leading to severe inflation and, in some ways, a hollow economy based on extracting wealth rather than developing a modern economy. And so Spain remained nearly medieval economically till the early 20th century. And it also made other countries jealous. And they sought to explore the New World too. In 1534, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River in search of a northwest passage, an all-water route through North America, so you could sail from Europe to Asia through North America. People would look for this till at least 1805, unsuccessfully, incidentally. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec on behalf of the French monarchy. And the French went further. In 1673, the French missionary, Father Jacques Marquette, and the explorer Louis Joliet explored the Mississippi Valley. Not much later, in 1681 and 1682, Robert de La Salle explored the Mississippi Valley further and named the area around it, including the Great Lakes, which he began to explore, named the area Louisiana in honor of his king, King Louis. And for the most part, the French worked with the Indians and lived alongside them, for the most part, in peace, only sending a few tens of thousands of settlers to the New World, most of whom lived in a few cities and trading posts and didn't seek, for the most part, to cut down the forests and farm the land. The French were mostly interested in trading for furs. They were not interested, outside a few areas near a few cities, in much farming. Likewise, they were not that interested in changing the Indians' culture, aside from converting them to Catholicism, at which they were fairly successful, and of course bringing them into a trading network whereby Europeans, or at least the French, could buy furs from the Indians, or hunt them themselves. Indeed, many French fur trappers, particularly the Coureurs de Bois, which means woods runners, who went trapping and trading far beyond the frontier, adopted many Indian habits, especially Indian-style clothing. They often married Indian women, both because they were lonely and to kind of make them part of the tribe they wished to trade with and hunt alongside. Later, the French government tried to take some more control over the fur trade and began to license traders and trappers known as voyageurs, who kind of replaced the Coureurs de Bois. Those voyageurs, too, lived amongst the Indians, adopted Indian customs, and often had Indian families. Now, in a few ways, the French government did try to control New France, in particular trying to prevent Huguenots from settling in France, these being French Protestants, who wanted to escape persecution by the Catholics in France. But the French government worried that if they were allowed to do so, they might make the New World too Protestant. So instead, many Huguenots facing persecution fled to the Netherlands, and from there to Dutch colonies such as New Netherland in the New World. Others went to England, and from there to the English colonies in the New World. Indeed, some famous Americans like Paul Revere, Davy Crockett, John Sevier are all descended from French Huguenots who came to the New World through England. And of course, Spain's wealth also attracted attacks from English privateers, essentially pirates licensed by the English government to attack the enemies of England and loot their ships. Perhaps the most famous of these was Sir Henry Morgan, who at one point captured the city of Havana. and Sir Francis Drake, who would fight the Spanish in many places, indeed circumnavigating the globe, the first Englishman to do so, and raiding the Spanish along the way. And furthermore, encouraging England to seek to set up colonies in the New World of their own. And we shall see how that works out for essentially the entire remainder of the class.